the feeling of shame, which I want to highlight, is different than guilt. Guilt is, oh, I've done something wrong. My behavior was wrong. Where shame is, I'm wrong. I'm bad. I've done something bad. And so that feeling of shame can be so intolerable and overwhelming that the body kind of has this wisdom of going, oh, we have to avoid it. It's just too much.
Welcome to the Soaring Child Podcast, where parents of children with ADHD learn tips and tricks to help their child soar at home, at school, and in life. We feature interviews with experts, medical professionals, and parents just like you who are learning how to reduce ADHD symptoms using food and other natural strategies. Because children with ADHD deserve to soar just like every other child. I'm your host, Dana Kay. Hello parents, this is Dana Kay here with another edition of the Soaring Child Podcast. We've got two guests with us this week. One is my little puppy here on my lap. Say hello, Cooper. Cooper is our resident Havanese poodle and he's joining us for today's episode. However, for those listening, you can't actually see him, but that's not what we're going to be exploring. I just wanted to let you know in advance that he is joining us because he might bark in the background. Anyway, now I want to ask you, parents that are listening, does your child show behaviors like envy, anger, anxiety, sadness, depression, loneliness, isolation, or even avoidance? Does your child have lower self-esteem and negative self-talk, or maybe even show signs that they've lost belief in themselves? If so, then you definitely want to stay tuned to today's episode. My real guest, Ashley Gobeil, is no stranger to frequent listeners of the Soaring Child podcast, and we are excited once again to welcome her back. Let's welcome Ashley Gobeil to the Soaring Child Podcast. Hi, Ashley. Thanks so much for joining us once again.
Hi, Donna. Thanks again for having me. I'm so looking forward to talking about today's topic.
I am too. And so I don't know, we can't get any feedback from listeners by writing in the comments because, in a podcast, it's very hard to do that. But we're going to start by talking about shame. Shame and ADHD. And so what I was alluding to at the beginning of the podcast was the signs and symptoms that can come from kids that are experiencing shame. So why don't we just launch in? Why don't you just tell us a little bit about shame and ADHD?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted some of those behaviors that parents seem to observe. And this seems to be one of the most, frequent thing that often comes up in our parent coaching and in a lot of the work that I'm doing with parents and children is parents start to share about some of the things they're observing. And I'm like, I think that your child might be experiencing, some profound shame. And when we say shame, it's kind of inside, as you said, it's their negative self-talk. And it seems to be very common with ADHD. I know, Dana, you and I have spoken about how some of that research has shown that by the age of 10, kids with ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages than their peers. And they say over time, something like 5 more negative messages per day than their peers. Mm. And those negative messages don't even have to be direct. I know we're not out there saying directly shaming children, but it's often what they notice. They can see when they've upset someone. They can, they know when their behavior is stressed out a parent or that they've gotten a piece of homework wrong or, it's kind of one of those subtle messages that happen as well over time. Or when the kind of adults and peers around them start to signal that there's a lot of disapproval around their behavior and a lot of disapproval around the way they show up. Yeah. So it seems to be quite a strong relationship between shame and ADHD that kind of develops over time.
Yeah. Can you maybe just share with us what some of those signs that I know I said a little bit at the beginning, but, what are some of the things that your child or the listeners' children may be doing or saying that could indicate that they are experiencing that shame?
Yeah, so some really common shame-related kind of behaviors as you mentioned, Dana, like the negative self-talk, maybe feeling really low, quite teary. However, there is the shield of shame. I don't know if we've spoken about this before.
We have definitely spoken about it, but I don't know if we've talked about it on the actual podcast. So I think it's a really good thing to explain.
Yeah, so the shield of shame was kind of a concept coined by it's Pat Ogden and Dan Hughes, who work in the space with lots and lots of children who've experienced hardships over time. And they did some research on shame. And the shield of shame is kind of almost imagine it's like a little armor that comes up for children. So the feeling of shame, which I want to highlight, is different than guilt. Guilt is, oh, I've done something wrong. My behavior was wrong. Where shame is, I'm wrong. I'm bad. I've done something bad. And so that feeling of shame can be so intolerable and overwhelming that the body kind of has this wisdom of going, oh, we have to avoid it. It's just too much. So this little armor comes up called the shield of shame. And there's 4 kind of categories of behaviors that usually sit on that shield. And the first one being minimizing. So you'll see those minimizing behaviors when they've done something. Blame, it's the kid who kind of goes, no, I didn't do it. It was my brother. Or if they wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have hit them. Or denying. So lying is a behavior that often comes up a lot with the parents that I work with. So often behind lying can be a sense of shame, where we've even seen them do the behavior or we know it's happened, but they are blatantly going, no, it didn't happen. Or the school has rung and said, oh, this is what happened today. And the child's like, no, that didn't happen. So lying is that big one, or denying on the shield, and rage. So the child who, when we maybe correct their behavior or they've made a mistake, might fly into that really explosive meltdown quite quicker or quite quickly. Yeah. So those are kind of the 4 main categories that we kind of see. And, often beside that, parents will say that their children will say things kind of just off the cuff, like, oh, I'm stupid, or I can't get it, or I'm not good enough, or you don't love me, or everyone hates me. And there's kind of these big beliefs that they seem to carry about themselves that come out in those moments of distress, which reasonably can feel really stressful or really heartbreaking for parents who are hearing this and not quite sure what to do or how to help.
Yeah, I mean, I as an adult, sorry, I've got little Cooper trying to jump off the chair here. But as an adult, like to even have a feeling of like no one likes me, or I'm bad is awful. But for a child whose brain is under construction and hasn't yet fully formed, to have those feelings would be so overwhelming. So I totally get the concept of the shield of shame. They're basically trying to, hide that shame away by doing these other things to take away the focus, I suppose. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's like take away the focus on self, or that others are looking at them, but also take away the focus of them having to look internally and be vulnerable and protect their little hearts. And some of it's like protect themselves from feeling feeling worse, or feeling like they are bad, or feeling like they're not good enough, or that they can't quite get it right. And if we think about what I've shared in other podcasts, is that we know, I always anchor in that Dr. Ross Green's concept around kids do well when they can. And if we know that a lot of the ADHD-based behaviors and symptoms and the way it presents itself are those nervous system-based responses or exacerbators and inflammation, that, kids really, really can't control a lot of those nervous system responses of, the screaming or the fight mode or the running away flight, or kind of being in that daydreamy, forgetful, lack of organization, freeze type of space. So, they can't help it. And then there's a lot of disapproval around it, can be really confusing and a tricky space for them to make sense of.
Definitely, and respond accordingly. And, when you add in and layer in inflammation into that, this poor child is just in a state. And really, you can't expect someone in that state to respond the way that you want them to respond or the way that they should respond. So, on that note, how do we respond, to our child when they might be experiencing that shame?
Yeah. So I guess the key thing I've been talking a lot about in the work I'm doing with parents is, can we find a way to leave that interaction with our child so that our child is feeling, no matter what's happened, no matter how tricky the behavior was or how challenging or even how much we want compliance in that moment, can we leave that interaction, leaving our child feeling seen, heard, soothed, and acknowledged for all parts of them? And, part of that is showing them that their emotional experience or their emotional state can be contained and shared with the adult, and we talk a lot about how we lean in with a lot of empathy. We let them know, if they're saying a comment like, for example, oh, I'm stupid and I can't get it right, I'm so bad, or everyone hates me, rather than, us trying to jump to responding to the question or resist that urge as a parent to want to take away their feeling and reassure them that, no, they are loved. You're not hated. Everything's, you're okay. Instead, respond with, whoa, you're feeling like you're stupid when you're doing this homework. That actually must feel pretty sad to be feeling like that right now. Or when they say, everyone hates me, or, I don't like you, that usually underneath is that deep hurt. So actually saying, oh, you're feeling like no one likes you right now. That must be pretty lonely. And when we can kind of like tap into what the emotional experience is in that moment that sits alongside of that, perhaps negative belief, you'll often see the kid move from that like big anger or that denying and lying into, like sometimes they'll move into teariness, or, they'll just feel really hurt. Does that make sense? Sometimes it's like really lean into that feeling that they might be sitting with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that I suppose that sort of ties in with what we've talked about in the past, in that, naming to tame it, name it to tame it, or, going in with that empathy and making them feel that, it's okay to have these feelings. And would you say that they're sort of on the same page?
Yeah, it's about letting them know it's in some ways that, yeah, it is okay to be feeling, or it's like acceptance. We want to just accept where they're at in that moment without wanting to move them too quickly into reassurance that, you are a great kid and there's all these other strengths that you have. Like, there is definitely a time and a place for that. But in that moment, when that child is experiencing shame, they really need to experience us as holding the space for them to experience that, and that showing that we want to hear what that's like. So when they say, something negative about themselves, or they're flawed, after they've come out of their fit of rage, you could reflect as a parent. You could even guess out loud, wonder if you're feeling a little bit bad about yourself right now. That must be really tough. And that, I guess, it's also really important, Dana, to highlight that a key point is when we want to correct behavior, when we've got a kid who maybe has a little bit of a fragile sense of self at the moment, or we can kind of see there's a pattern of shame-related behaviors, that it doesn't mean we don't move into correcting their behaviors or, hold that limit setting and boundary setting. But the way we do it, it's really important. It's done with a lot of kindness. It might be really firm, but kind boundary, and reassuring the child that, it's about wanting them to do a behavior differently, but they are still loved. Because there is, and even an unintentional rupture that occurs in the relationship when a parent or an adult corrects behavior.
Oh, yeah. And I can totally understand that. And I'm thinking about what you said in just being in that moment and just acknowledging, how they're feeling and helping them understand those feelings. And as a parent, I know for myself, all I want to do is make them feel better. And so it's probably something really new for a lot of listeners to think to themselves, well, I can't tell them that it's not good for me right now to go, oh, don't worry, you'll be fine. Or don't worry that, you're loved and everyone likes you, and to try and get rid of those feelings. But, what you're sharing, it makes total sense. And I can see how it would be very, very helpful for the child. But it's going to require a lot of willpower for us as parents to definitely not try to go into that help mode.
And fix mode, exactly. It's like, just slow. I said to a mum the other day, slow it down, pause, and just resist that, mama bear intention in that moment to go, oh, I need to take away this deep sense of sadness and this negative feeling away from my child. And actually, interestingly, the child even said in session, Mum, I just need you to listen. I just to listen. And it was really hard for her to listen because she really didn't, it was really hard to sit in the discomfort of his emotional space. Yeah. Because it triggers all of our own stuff. Sometimes we feel guilty or worried. So just slowing it down and going, okay, I can hear my child struggling. I need to acknowledge that they're struggling.
Yeah.
And it can be a little bit tricky when there's been a behavior of lying or denying it. For us as parents, we really want to correct that behavior in the moment. It's like, we can come back to that in the moment. Let's just acknowledge that our child might be feeling really poorly about themselves. And that's a really tough space to be in.
And, I find as a parent, just disconnecting from the emotional side of the situation really helps. If I make that conscious thought to myself, okay, I'm just going to disconnect with what's being said, with what's actually happening, and I am just going to be there and acknowledge and listen and go with empathy. It's actually a lot easier. If you disconnect as the mama bear and really just be, it's a lot easier to go forward with that strategy. Now, I want to pose a bit of a tricky one to you. I have someone very dear to my heart who, is struggling with one of their children right now, and I've shared a number of things that you talked about that with her, and so the mum has tried a couple of things, but she says to me, like, every time I do that, it escalates. I know my child just needs space and needs to be by themselves, and every time that I be there with them, they get worse and worse and worse, and the behaviors get worse and worse, and they just want to go and be by themselves.
Yeah. And that can definitely happen. Already, as you're describing it, I'm thinking, yeah, I've got some thoughts there. Really, I guess first acknowledging, like, so tough as a parent who's especially trying a different approach or trying a new way of parenting, and then moving into that strategy or approach, and it actually escalates the child. So it's so like how confusing when it's like, oh, this is supposed to, bring some attunement. Because when we name that child's emotion, or we, like I said, hold space or be the container for their nervous system in their experience, that is a experience of attunement. That's us trying to attune to their feelings and needs. If that escalates the child, if that creates more pushback where they get more angry or they want to run away or they start lashing out more, it can sometimes be a sign that vulnerability is a really scary space for them. And when I say vulnerability, it's like, oh, you've just named my feeling. I have to protect that. It doesn't quite feel safe. So the nervous system's kind of sending some messaging between brain and body going, nope, it's not really safe to have my feeling named. I don't trust it. I'm not quite sure if the adults are really going to get me, or am I going to get in trouble after this? So there could be some anxieties. And a lot of this happens on a very quick automatic process or unconscious process for kids. And look, some kids do need a little bit of space when they're having a really big nervous system response. Of course, over time, we want to show that we can give them that space and boundary and respect the boundary that they go, okay, I might need a little bit of taking space time. But I always say to adults, it's always up to us to initiate repair. as opposed for waiting for the child to come to us. So that could even look like checking on them every couple of minutes. If they're in their like cozy corner, they're in their space, they're taking some quiet time, and letting them know, okay, I can see that you need some space. So I'm going to walk away. I'm going to go get myself a glass of water, but I really want to be helpful for you so you don't have to do this alone with this really big feeling. So I'm going to come back in and check on you. I know there's a few things in there without knowing the parent and the family. It's hard to really fine tune, but my guesses would be there might be something around naming the feeling feels a little bit too vulnerable. And I don't know if you know Brene Brown's work, vulnerability and shame, they sit together.
Okay. And so, how do we help a child overcome that vulnerability? I think to my children, and I think to, how did we make that? How did I get to a point where my kids were feeling vulnerable with that feelings being opened up? Probably because, when they were younger, we didn't talk about their feelings very much. And so would that be sort of the way that happens? Or so, how do we help them if they every time immediately have that reaction or want to be by themselves or escalate when you do that? How do we overcome that? How do we just be consistent and still tell them that I'm here for you when you're ready? I want to help you with these feelings, and go away and then come back a couple minutes later. Do we just be consistent?
Yeah. Great question. I think there's a couple of things in there. First one, where you're kind of saying, is this kind of maybe how it develops? Is, I think societally, it's quite normative that we often don't talk about feelings a lot, just in general or in families. Or if we do, it might be when they're a little bit younger. And so, yes, so sometimes I often ask parents or invite them into reflecting on what's the whole family's relationship with feelings. Is feelings a new thing that you're talking about? Is this a really new experience? And so change can be tricky. Yes, in terms of what to do, consistency, predictability are still absolutely key. And it just might be about tweaking it. So, and I would even often coach parents to reflect on the child's struggle or difficulty with me naming the feeling. So you don't want to push to the point where you keep naming it and you can see they're escalating. That's unhelpful. Instead, it's like, whoa, you're really angry right now. You're even stomping your feet. Okay, yeah. And you're so, so upset because I wouldn't let you have the ice cream. It's really hard to say no. So they get even more angry because you've named that feeling. I would go, whoa, it sounds like it's really unhelpful for me to name your feeling. I can see that you don't like it when I'm letting you know how I think you're feeling, or you might not. So you might be reflecting or mirroring back what you're noticing. Okay, it's made you more upset because I've named your feeling. It's almost like you want to say things that the child's going to possibly agree with. They're like, they're kind of going, oh, yeah, I am getting more angry. Again, this would be quite subconscious in some ways. I am getting more angry because mum is naming my feeling. And then you can respect that boundary by going, okay, you really don't want me to name your feeling. It feels uncomfortable for you. You don't like it. I think I'm being unhelpful right now. I say that to kids all the time when I run groups, and families like, oop. And if I notice they get escalated, if I name a feeling or if I name a strength. And so I'll say, oh, I think maybe I'm being a little unhelpful right now. So I'm going to give you some space, but I'm right here, or I'm going to come check back on you in a couple minutes. Yeah. And then I do, and I continue to show up in that predictable way. So that over time, they learn there's a difference between us saying, hey, I'm here for you. I actually worked with a family not that long ago who kept saying, I'm really here for you when you want to talk. But they realized over time with some coaching that, they were saying it, but their behavior wasn't really showing that they were genuinely there for that child when they wanted to talk, which took some time. So it's like, just keep going, showing up after that few minutes. And if they're not ready, you go, you're not ready right now. You're still having that really big feeling, and letting them know your intention on why you're continuing to check in. I really want to be helpful. I can see you're having you're having huge emotions, or you're having really big feelings depending on their age. And I want to be able to help you with them. But looks like it's too hard to receive help right now. That's okay. So it's almost like we're accepting, this is kind of a bit of a dance now. You're also accepting where they're at. But some children in particular, where there has been a developed sense of shame, or as you said, a poor sense of self or lower self-esteem, receiving help can be pretty tricky as well.
So, on that note, how do we break that cycle? How can we increase their self-esteem and help them sort of build that more positive sense of self?
Yeah. So there's a few things. First one, often in the context of shame, is talking to parents about when there is a rupture, when you've done correcting behavior, when you've had a bad day and it's just all gone really terribly. Think about how you can do repair. We can always go back and do repair. It can be like a few minutes later. It can be the next day. And I'm working with some parents in our in the Thrive program, Donna, and coaching calls that repair is one of the best tools they're saying they have. So when they've had a really tough time, they go back and say, I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to be helpful. I'm really sorry that I flipped my lid, or that was really hard when I had to stop you from hitting your sister. You were really mad at me that I had to put in that boundary and that you lost, time on your iPad or whatever it might be. So really just acknowledging what happened and doing some repair around saying sorry if we've made a mistake as adults, and just letting them know that we still love them no matter what, no matter how hard or bad things get. My love will never drain from you. It's always a good one that kids seems to land on kids. Like, I was really angry earlier. I was really angry, and I'm in charge of my feelings as an adult. I was really angry, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean I love you any less. And letting them know that we believe in them, even when they don't believe in themselves, letting them know that we have this positive hope, for their future, that you're going to do amazing, great things in their lives. And they have these awesome superpowers, despite, some of the ADHD symptoms can be awesome superpowers, and that they are so lovable and so special, even if they don't feel like that sometimes. And even if us as adults sometimes, when we get upset or angry, it might feel like that to them.
Yeah.
Noticing their strengths out loud is such an important one, but it's also really important not to, Dr. Gabor Mate talks about this in his ADHD Scattered book around not using praise too much. So, or not using praise when they have simply complied with direction. Yeah.
Interesting, because I was going to say that a lot of people out there do say that, they use the analogy filling the bucket. The kids' buckets are drained, and it's different to my bucket that I use with information. But they're talking about in terms of those positive affirmations of like, wow, I just noticed that you put your shoes on. I'm so grateful that you did that. So you're saying that Dr. Gabor Mate is saying, no, you shouldn't do that.
Not too much is
not
the
too
key.
Much, not too much. Well,
yes.
what's a balance? What is that too much?
What is too much? And part of that is if we are using praise, overly using praise, or using praise in the context of when they just comply. So it's like, oh, you've done that for me. Great. What can happen with the child who experiences shame or a low sense of self is that they can, it kind of sends that underlying message, could come across that, again, it's the high value is not on who the child is, but what the child does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's often important then to scatter in or sprinkle in noticing strengths, such as after they've, when they've had a meltdown, let's say they've used a new strategy, like, wow, even though you had a really tough time today at school, I noticed that you were able to come home and do some mindful coloring. Or, oh my gosh, even though earlier you were having such a big fight with, your sibling, you were able to do some big, deep breaths with me. Or you were able to let me help with you and sit with you quietly. Like, it's kind of reframing even the tricky times. And yeah, spending time in individual connection time, just filling up their cup through their love language is another way as well.
Yeah, we talk about the love languages a lot, and I think it's such a good tool to have. And so, if listeners, if you haven't looked into the love language, there is a quiz online, especially for kids, to determine what their love languages are, and when you can determine what it is, how they receive love. And so, what have we got? We've got affirmations. We have quality time, physical touch. Is it gifts?
And doing acts of service. So
acts of service, yes, and it's so enlightening. I mean, I picked both of my kids even before I did the test for them, but it's really eye-opening, because if you want them to feel better, if you want them to feel love, that's the way that they receive it. And so definitely go and check that out. You can just Google kids love language quiz on Google. Look, it's always hard for that balance, but I think one of the biggest things for me was when I started to change the way that I parented for my child that had ADHD. It was very much about practice. It doesn't feel natural. It's like learning a new language. And so, in the beginning, even though, what we were just talking about, we don't want to praise too much on, basic things. I found that when I was starting out, I wanted to praise everything. And that actually got me into the habit of rephrasing the way that I was talking. So once I got into that habit and then it just rolled off my tongue, I didn't have to praise as much and did it the way that you were talking. But I think to start, it really is just about that consistency and thinking about, okay, well, in every single situation, until it becomes a habit, how can I change the way that I parent my child, or how can I change it to more of that positive reframing, or that, coming from a place of empathy, naming it to tame it. I mean, I love all the strategies that you share, Ashley, and enjoy talking about them so much. You were just in my Facebook group the other day, and you were doing a training in there, and I feel like I need to tell our listeners about it as well, because you're in a training in there sharing some 3 tips for parenting kids with ADHD. So for listeners, if you haven't joined our Facebook group yet, it's called ADHD Parent Nutrition Support Group. You can just check that out on Facebook. But Ashley was a guest in there the other day doing this training. And I got so excited about it because I love all the strategies that she uses. And Ashley has actually worked with us to develop a special program to help change the way that you parent a child with ADHD. And I got so excited about it that I gave away a special code for 50% off that course. So I feel I should do the same for the listeners, don't you, Ashley?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that code for anyone listening that wants to check that out is Dana50, and we're going to drop the link to the parenting program down below. And I think that the code goes for, I don't know, another 7 days or something. So be sure to be quick to check that out. 50% off. I got a little bit excited. So just tell me quickly, or tell listeners quickly, what they can learn in there. I mean, we've talked about the shield of shame. We've talked about name it to tame it, flipping the lid. Tell us some other insights on what's in there.
Yeah, I was thinking there's so much in there. How do you start to break
Sum it up in it? Yeah.
There's a whole module, like section and lesson on shame, and how we can, really focus on just simply delighting in children, just being in the world. There's all about rituals and routines. So we look at bedtimes, mornings, afternoons. As you said, how do we move into more positivity and proactive parenting, working towards a calmer home? There's lots in there around, us as parents, and mindfulness and mindful activities for children, the connection before correction. There's a whole big module on looking behind the behaviors and beneath the behaviors. So really understanding the iceberg metaphor. Yeah, there's lots of handouts and lots of videos for each lesson of me talking about the concepts. You don't have to read a lot. You can just listen along and learn. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is awesome. And look, honestly, it was one of the keys in, my son's ADHD symptom reduction. And I always talk about ADHD symptom reduction in a natural way. It is a number of little ingredients. And so I think I've used the pie analogy probably a number of times on the podcast, but for those listening, I'll just quickly explain that again. It's like when you're with ADHD symptom reduction, when you're doing it naturally, there's a number of ingredients go into it. And it's like trying to bake a pie. You don't need the pie to be the most amazing pie. You just want a good pie that everyone can enjoy. And there are a number of different ingredients that come into that. And parenting specific for ADHD is definitely one of those ingredients. And Ashley is just, I mean, you're right here with me, but I just love you, and you just have the most calming way about you that every time you come on this podcast, I feel so calm. I know so many listeners do. And, when you're inside our program, in the ADHD Thrive Method for Kids, where you do a weekly parent and behavioral therapist group coaching call, the parents just absolutely just rave about you. So guys, if you're interested in that, check that out. That 50% off was just really, I got excited and gave it to everyone in the Facebook group when Ashley was doing that training. So how could I not share it with the Soaring Child listeners as well? So Ashley, any last thoughts on shame and increasing self-esteem and helping our kids, build a more positive sense of self?
I think the last thing I would just add is for parents to reflect or just know that you absolutely can support your child to develop a more positive sense of self, and that your child, even if they're struggling now and they're not feeling great about themselves, that we can shift their trajectory. It doesn't mean that they're going to be struggling forever. We can support them to develop a more positive view and have more positive beliefs about who they are. As you said, Dana, it takes practice. It sometimes takes some extra support around some of the things that you can be doing. But you absolutely, as parents, have a power in being able to, support your child to develop
and
a
thrive,
stronger sense of self and thrive and flourish. And we see parents that we work with do that all the time. It's absolutely happening.
Beautiful. I think that's a perfect way to end up. Thank you, Ashley, for joining me again today and just sharing your beautiful self, your calming self, your knowledge and your experience with all of our listeners. For those links that we just talked about and for that code, check out the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us, Ashley.
Thank you, Dana, for having me again. It's always such a pleasure.
Such a pleasure. Listeners, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Soaring Child. I'm Dana Kate, your ADHD health practitioner. Keep on thriving.